Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about leaning into ambivalence and how that can actually be productive or helpful rather than stymieing or locking you into inactivity or inaction. So I'll start with my takeaway message. Ambivalence is usually seen as blocking action, stalling decision making, freezing people into a pattern of immobility, but some recent research shows that there's ways of cultivating or leaning into ambivalence that can help us be more prone to take action, to take steps where we have a divided mind. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'll be talking almost certainly less than 20 minutes today. If you have questions while I'm talking or at the end, you can type them in and I will try to answer them live. This will also be curated on both Facebook and YouTube, so if afterwards you have questions, you can type them in and I'll try to answer them there. So starting out with, ambivalence is usually defined as having conflicting feelings about an object or a course of action, and those conflicting feelings have to be of positive valence and negative valence. So some part of you wants you to do it, sees positive aspects of doing it, or positive feelings toward a person or a group activity, an item, and other parts of you are aware of and attuned to negative aspects of that. And the ambivalent researchers, or researchers on ambivalence, I should say, categorize ambivalence into felt ambivalence, which is the subjective feeling, and usually described as aversive, where you are feeling torn between multiple sets of action because you have different conflicting feelings about something, and potential ambivalence, which is usually described as more objective or more cognitive in terms of thinking through or aware of there are conflicts between positions I hold or attitudes I feel towards a certain activity. And interestingly, subjective ambivalence does not always particularly correlate strongly with objective ambivalence as measured this way, speaking already to the fact that for most of us, or many of us, ambivalence is difficult to hold on to, and we tend to try to push conflicting thoughts away or deal with them often with avoidant mechanisms, and often we're not aware of our own range of motivations and feelings. A related concept, and some people use the term cognitive dissonance for any ambivalent situation where you have two conflicting views. More often, or a little more precisely, it's when you are either have already engaged in a behavior or are about to engage in a behavior that is inconsistent or in conflict with some of your attitudes. So there's a difference between the two, and different brains work with different ways to try to reconcile or resolve this. And again, particularly for many people, this leads to procrastination, to avoidance, and that may be true of any of us, but particular people with ADHD, people with OCD, people with a wide range of anxiety conditions may be particularly prone to being stymied, locked in place, immobilized by ambivalence. So some of the recent research that's gotten attention, and this researcher, Tally Reich, who started at Stanford and now is at Yale, has done a lot of recent research on ambivalence and leaning into it. And I mean, certainly there's some people who generally don't feel ambivalent, or who feel so assured of their own decision making or their own feelings that they don't need to lean into this or use this technique. So this approach, or her research, is directed more at people who are, to begin with, more preventive-oriented, sort of more fear-based or more avoidance-based, rather than those who jump into situations without thinking or without self-doubt. Some of her earlier work suggested that part of the value or cultivating ambivalence can help to lower expectations for success, and by actually lowering the expectations helps decrease the risk of failure, risk of rejection, risk of feeling bad if you do it. So the most pointed or direct interventional experiment she did put people in an ambivalent situation where there were both good reasons and or scary reasons for for engaging in a certain activity, either applying to a job or bidding for a house or making a wager in a sort of online gaming situation. And she had one group of participants focus on 3 positive reasons for taking a course of action, and she had the other group of people focus on 1 positive and 2 negative reasons for moving forward with the state of action. And you would think that my assumption, and I think most people's would be, the more you focus on the positive, that group is going to be more likely to plow forward and go ahead with things. But her finding, and she tried to create situations that were translatable to the real world. These were sort of laboratory human subject situations, but what she found, so not surprisingly, an assessment of ambivalence, the group who was focused first on 1 positive and 2 negative, as opposed to 3 positives, did feel more ambivalence. But they actually took more direct action to achieve their goal, and again, some study on this showed that they felt less fear of failure, and part of that, again, was that they had cognitively shifted by sort of setting a lower expectation or acknowledging that there could be failure, there might not be success. That sort of devalued to some extent the force or the risk involved in attacking. If you know something right away you may not win at, then you're losing less face if you do lose at it, if you're going to frame it as losing or winning. So her recommendations from this is that in situations of ambivalence, when you have strong feelings on to go ahead and to not go ahead with it, to generate a list of reasons. And so part of this is to generate your own list. It's not worth seeking out your mentor at work or your mother or your brother or your best friend or online Google audience in terms of what they think, because this is more to do with your feelings and your motivation and your reluctance to act. So generate a list of reasons to act, reasons not to act, based on yourself. Sort of do it fairly quickly, because what's important to you, what's salient to you, what's significant to you will come up quickly. If you're sort of searching around and trying to force yourself to think about things, they're probably not that important in terms of your attitudes or your decision making on this topic. So she'd say also keep the list short. So again, you don't want to list 402 different things, even though particularly someone with ADD or OCD may want to run through all the absolute possibilities. But again, this is focusing on the salient ones, the most important, the most emotionally charged for you. And again, keep that list. Her favorite list is 1 positive and 2 negatives, but you could double it and take 2 positives and 4 negatives, or even go up to 3 positives and 6 negatives. But again, keep it short, keep it in that ratio of 1 positive to 2 negative. Make sure you're actually feeling them. So the goal of this is not to neutralize this and not just feel indifferent or not caring. It is to be in touch and tuned with and try to embrace simultaneously these different forces that your decision-making process is feeling. And again, her research would suggest that this leads to more likelihood to take an action. I would combine, once you've decided that you're going to take an action, and I have a separate video on this, I would combine it with my approach towards avoiding procrastination. So that's the SPAWN approach. Schedule a specific time, prepare ahead so you can do it right at that time, and at the moment you're doing it, get in touch with your wants at that time, and then at that moment, don't focus on the negatives. But again, to get yourself ready to make the decision, leaning into the ambivalence can be helpful. interesting, there's a fair amount of overlap between this approach of leaning into ambivalence and what's called motivational interviewing, which was largely devised as a way to help people dealing with addictions to overcome or to get to a place of better, greater healthiness and more commitment to their decision making to avoid the substance or behavior that was harmful to themselves. And much of the older approach had a more coercive, you shouldn't smoke, this is going to hurt you, emphasizing the bad, providing psychoeducational, but sort of coercive, and doctor telling patients or the government telling citizens to do X, Y, or Z. And in several experimental setups, the motivational interviewing approaches are more helpful. So motivational interviewing relies on listening as much as directing. It does some of both. It relies on empowering the individual so they feel that they are invested in their choice and able to make choices rather than, again, just being told or directed what to do. It involves acceptance and compassion for the self, and it involves working with someone from where they are at the beginning, not assuming that they've already come to certain conclusions, decisions, feelings, or states. And it involves looking at their reasons, their positive reasons for engaging in the behavior they're doing. Because if you tell them cigarettes are only bad and, they actually feel better or more relaxed or a little more focused, or it's a way to take a break. I mean, if all these alcohol, cigarettes were only bad or only generated horrible negative feelings and outcomes, no one would ever use these things. Clearly there's some pull innately, biochemically, enhanced by lots of social training and conditioning. But if you don't acknowledge why people are doing some of these things, then it's harder to get them to change or let go of that or find acceptable, healthier alternatives. So some of that's also being replayed at a social level currently, or in controversies over masking or what's being framed as coercive government instructions. And I think it's, rather than embracing ambivalence as a society, we've sort of tried to dichotomize it, and yes, this has been pushed by politicians on one side or the other to reframe in unhelpful ways. So jumping over to a little bit about specifically people with ADHD, I mean, one is that there's one group of people with ADHD who have what's called positive illusory bias, and there's also another talk about that. People with positive illusory bias usually are very action motivated, confident in themselves, not that excessively processing negative feedback, negative communication. They don't need this approach. They're usually not feeling ambivalence. But many people with ADHD have more trouble focusing, so their brain may more readily jump from one aspect or angle, or positive or negative, or bounce back and forth. So again, how this writing things down approach can help is that if it's concretely written there, and particularly if it's written in your own language, and you tell yourself these are the 3 top important angles or aspects to look at, or 6, that may help eliminate jumping on to further and further angles, thoughts, possibilities, or angles. What else? And again, combining that with the anti-procrastination approach I've outlined before. And at a different level, but I think coming at the same thing, is what I call the quest, not test approach. So again, the researcher indicates that some of the people who are most dwelling in an ambivalent space to begin with are those people who are fear or prevention based. So they have maybe a bias towards avoiding or involving. They're evaluating the risks, they're evaluating the downsides. They're less focused on the positive, but they're also viewing situations as tests. This is where I could fail, this is where I could not get what I want to get. And if you take a step back, if you look at the bigger picture, if you ask what are my overarching goals, what are my quests, what am I trying to achieve, that in itself is going to be a pro-motivational, pro-action approach, because you're less worried whether this particular test is going to work or not, because the test isn't what's important. You know, you may apply, you may not get this job, but if you don't apply anywhere, you're not getting any jobs, and hopefully you can learn more about this job, and it will, if your quest is to contribute productively to society or to get financially secure income or whatever it is, if you keep returning back to the greater quest, you're going to be, if you're keeping that in mind or in picture, then you're going to be more motivated to act than, again, if you view each specific action towards that quest as what's all important. So lastly, and I'm going to summarize it, that one of the phrases I've been probably overusing is, and tied into leaning into or cultivating ambivalence, is life is complex. Life does have positive and negative angles or aspects of almost everything going on, and positive and negative reasons to act or to not act. So my phrase is, embrace nuance or you're going to be creating new angst. So that's about all I have to say for today. Next week I'm going to be talking about the topic of serious mental illness and whether ADHD is a serious mental illness or not. I'm not seeing any questions that have come in yet, so I will wish you all a happy, healthy week. If anything comes in the next second, I'll try to answer it, and I'll be back next Friday at 11. That's all for now.